So like we were discussing earlier about controls and web parts are just direct descendants of the web control via the part class. And what they do is they allow users to manipulate their position and configuration within web part zones on a page. And so a web part zone has methods that ASP.NET uses in conjunction with the web part manager to manipulate the instance of the web part over the course of its life cycle. So think of it as like being able to, if you have a home page with maybe MSN or Yahoo or something like that, and you have little widgets that you can drag in and drag out, that's the same thing. Exact same thing. That's what SharePoint is doing. And in SharePoint, actually in ASP.NET, the interaction and life cycle of all the web parts is controlled by a web part manager. So in SharePoint, since it's built on top of ASP.NET, it has a special web part manager. So it inherits from the ASP.NET web part manager and it has its own. And its job is to serialize and deserialize the web part instances, not just the web part, but all the metadata about the web part to the content database, to the SharePoint content database. So the way web parts, kind of how they have evolved, is back in SharePoint 2003 was when web parts came out. So that was Windows SharePoint Services 2.0, WSS 2.0. They're part of the foundation, not the server product. And they caught on really well that they actually got incorporated into ASP.NET. And so when ASP.NET 2.0 came out, then that's when web parts were incorporated into them. But the SharePoint team had to preserve backwards compatibility. The object model still includes the SharePoint.WebPartPages.WebPart, but when you build web parts, you should be using the one from ASP.NET. So the web part class from ASP.NET, which comes from system.web.ui.webcontrols.webparts. So Chrome is one of the functions of the web part zone class is to render what's called Chrome. Chrome is the title bar, the menu, the border that surrounds the web parts. When you're building a web part, you're not responsible for that. It's rendered by the web part framework. And the only time that happens is when a web part actually exists within the web part zone. Now, the nice thing about Chrome is that it provides a common look and feel to all web parts in an application. So you do, in your web part, it's important to realize that Chrome renders a div tag with some CSS classes. That's how it provides a common look and feel. So your web part could actually inherit some of the style elements from that div tag. So if you're testing your web part outside of SharePoint or putting into a page outside of a web part zone, so maybe you're building as a control first and then you're going to convert it into a web part, it's probably going to look different than when you actually place it in the web part zone in a browser. The important thing, though, about the Chrome is that as developers, you don't have to create that. This framework's already taking care of that for you. So the page and control lifecycle is complex. It's beyond the scope of this chapter, but you can develop web parts by mastering just a few simple methods. Basically, you need to know what happens and when. So in ASP.NET, the on init method, that's where all your controls are going to get initialized for the very first time. And then on load, that occurs when your control has actually been loaded by the ASP.NET page. And then CreateChildControls is a method that you can override that gets called by the page framework. So child controls, think of the ASP.NET page as a tree of controls. And so the page would be like the root of the tree, and then any controls that follow below that are child controls, they're children. There's a method that you can call to make sure that a control exists before you reference it, and that's ensure_child_controls. That ensures that CreateChildControls has been called and completed. And then the onPreRender event, that is a good place to perform any tasks or fetch information that's going to be required for rendering. And then RenderContents is where you actually render the contents inside the Chrome of the web part. So CreateChildControls, most web parts that have visual elements compose other controls into a greater whole. So every web control has a controls collection property that contains the controls of which it's composed of. And those controls in the controls collection are called child controls. Again, because the page is like a tree of controls, and the page is the root. And then each node of the tree can have either 0 or however many child controls it needs. Any controls that you're depending on in your web part, then you can use CreateChildControls method to instantiate them there. RenderContents is responsible for rendering the control and all of its children within any layout that the control requires. So at this point in the rendering pipeline, all of the child controls have already been loaded, and then the only thing that's left to do is just write their HTML to the output string. So in RenderContents, you shouldn't be changing any properties of the child controls. You're going to be setting the properties of your child controls in onPreRender. What we're going to do right now is we're going to go into Visual Studio and we're going to create a web part, and we're going to take a look at the CreateChildControls and RenderContents methods. Okay, we're back in our Visual Studio solution, and I'm going to add a new web part. This is going to be a standard web part, and I'm going to call it list web part. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some dummy data in here. System.collections.generic reference. There we go. Okay. And I'm going to override on init. Just going to initialize our data here. Actually, I don't want to do that. I'll keep this. In fact, let's just do this. Let's just make it easy. Let's make this a string array. Do the same here. Okay, now we'll initialize the birds array. Okay, we got our data now. So we're going to have we have some controls we're going to add here too. So we're going to have a list box. And we'll have a label. And a button. Okay. So we'll go ahead and create child controls. We're going to initialize the list box. And we'll set the data source. So we're going to do data binding on the list box. So we'll set the data source equal to our string array of fruits. And then we'll tell it to go ahead and bind to that. Now what we need to do is add the list box control to the web parts. Right now it's not associated with it. We need to add it to the control tree. So we just get an instance of the current control tree. We'll call add and put in the list box. And now we'll add a label. We'll initialize our label. Set its text equal to fruits. And then we'll add it. Oops. Okay, now we just have our button left. We'll set the text to the button. So we just added the click event handler to the button. And now what we want to do is add the button to the control tree. Let's get rid of our exception here. So inside of our click method, all we're going to do is change the data source of the list box from fruits to birds. So let's get hold of our list box, set the data source. And have to rebind the list box. And then we're going to change the label to say birds as well. So let's go ahead and deploy this. And we'll put it on our home page of our team site. Okay, we'll go edit the page, and we'll add this web part. We'll save that. And we'll just test it out here. Okay, so it's working. Let's go back home. We toggle the list, it goes from fruits to birds. So it's working, but it doesn't look very good. Looks kind of ugly. So let's change the layout a little bit on this. So let's go back to code. And we can change layout by overriding RenderContents. So we can tell the label to, what we're doing here is we're just controlling the order of how the HTML is going to get rendered to the browser. So we call render control, pass in the writer. So we're saying, okay, render label first, and then we're going to use that writer. We'll write out just a line break element. And then we'll do the same thing with the list box. And then we'll render the button. So now we'll have everything is side by side. We should have everything lined up vertically now by doing this. So let's go ahead and deploy this. Close this, we'll open the page again. Notice how we changed the layout, but we didn't really have to change the functionality. And it's all because of RenderContents right here is where it's allowing us to have control over the layout of our controls inside of our web part. So it looks like we're rendering the controls twice here. So there's something that we forgot to do in the code. So I'm going to go back to RenderContents, and here's the culprit right here. I shouldn't be calling base.renderContents because what that's doing is it's rendering all of these controls here in CreateChildControls. It's rendering all those controls that have been added. So I don't want to render them all yet. I want to render them one at a time. So here I'm going to render the label first, line break, render the list box, a line break, and then render the button. So Let me go ahead and deploy this again. Let's bring that page back up. And so when we click the toggle list button, it changes just as it did before. It changes the data source out from fruits to birds. So this is demonstrating that by modifying render contents, we're just modifying the way the elements are being laid out on the screen, but the functionality remained exactly the same inside this web part.